Are you considering buying or playing Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, but want to be sure it's worth your time, money, as well as being safe for your mental health first? You've come to the right video, friend. I'm the CC and Let CC Play, and this is an Anxious Gamer review where I aim to answer these questions. Going into Hellblade, I had imagined a walking simulator of sorts where, during the review, I'd have some gag about having to look up what the definition of a game was, as I'd be unsure if this particular title even qualified as such. Then I'd have to slap a bunch of warnings on it because it royally messed me up. It wasn't very far into the game I had these notions knocked out of me, but it was a bit of a rocky start. The game began with Senua getting off her boat onto a shore where we take control of her. Almost immediately we see a stone and Senua's voices are telling her to focus.
She needs to focus now.
Well, it turns out you can inspect these stones, so to speak, but the game refers to this action as focusing. It doesn't point this out in any way aside from the voice's audio cues. This is the part where I resorted to what any gamer does in this situation, pushing every button, obviously. That didn't work, so I resorted to the next logical step, checking the controls in the pause menu. For keyboard, it turned out the key I needed was E, but you have to hold it for a moment, so that's probably why the button mashing was destined to fail. With that out of the way, I pressed on. After some minor introductory walking and the first puzzle of the game, which I'll touch on later, I came to the first taste of combat. Once again, nothing had appeared to inform me of the controls, but as I had already been forced to check the pause menu, I was fairly prepared. But even so, I couldn't see any beneficial reason to not give some sort of pop-up during the opening few minutes of the game. At first, I had considered that maybe they wanted to go for a very minimalistic approach to the HUD, which I could respect. I was a huge fan of that in the Dead Space series, and it's probably one of the first features that comes to mind when I think back to them. However, having to pause the game to go over the controls was far more jarring than a sentence or two flashing on the screen very briefly would have been. This design choice only further confused me as after the first fight, a short cutscene played that showcased and discussed the game's unique features called Rot, where it says, through a couple of sentences flashing on screen, that every time you fell, it will grow closer to Senua's head, and if it reaches her head, all your progress will be lost. Interesting concept, color me intrigued, but couldn't they have added a couple more just like that to explain that E was focus and F was to interact with things? As for the combat, I never figured out if I liked it or not. I don't think I could fairly say I outright hated it, but at the same time, I felt it detracted from the game more often than it added. I think for the setting of the story, Senua 100% had to be fighting things on a fairly regular basis, and I couldn't imagine this game without combat in some form. I'm just not sure the style they chose was the best way to convey Senua's warrior side. I often found myself thinking that even some very cinematic QuickTime events could have been an improvement, and I say that knowing many people, very fairly so I might add, disliked them. There was some depth to the combat, but it was all a very standard affair. Light and heavy attacks, dodging, blocking, parrying if you timed it right, and eventually a slow time mechanic. In fairness, there were a handful of times I felt truly immersed and like a real tough gal in some extended fights, but much more often I'd be entranced with a story or a puzzle I was working on and be interrupted by a short fight and think to myself, ugh, let's get this over with. The bosses were probably even worse in this regard. By the time I got the ending scene of Senua finishing them, I was overjoyed. Not because it was some grand challenge I had overcome, but because it boiled down to 5 minutes of uninspired clicking. The bosses and the special variants of trash mobs all followed the same pattern, which didn't help the combat to impress me. It pretty much followed as normal dodging, blocking, and attacking, then they'd do something to go incorporeal, and you'd have to use your focus to knock them out of it. I suppose there was one amusing moment when I learned the shield guys had a weakness to Garen. That novelty quickly wore off though. So combat was pretty meh in the end. I liked the puzzles and story quite a bit more, and that's coming from the girl who plays games like Vampire or Mass Effect and just want people to quit talking so she can kill more baddies. The puzzles weren't particularly difficult, but I enjoyed the creativity of them. The first kind you encounter are ruin doors, where you have to comb the environment to find something that resembles the shape of the ruins on the door, then have Senua focus on it. These are prevalent throughout the game and rarely posed a challenge, as they give you an indicator you are close to the answer. Was this an elaborate ruse to make us appreciate the hard work of the artists? Maybe, but I enjoyed it. Another example of the puzzles are the illusion ones, where you'd look through an arch or something similar to see the landscape change, and you'd have to do this back and forth to reach where you were going. Again, not terribly hard, but they really stuck out to me. There were a few others, but these two made up the vast majority of the game and were my favorite. The story, as with most indie games that walk the line of being a purely cinematic experience, is easily the highlight. Senua is looking to save her slain lover, Dillion, from the clutches of Hela in Hell. As she journeys through this forsaken place, the darkness within her, which I believe to be an incarnation of mental illness, will worsen and she must overcome it along with the challenges Hella has put before her. As I intend to provide mostly spoiler-free reviews, I won't go much deeper than that, but I will say that the story did an outstanding job of making me feel something, and by the end I was in tears in the best way possible. As for the difficulty, I'm going to have to rate it middle of the road. I just left the game on its default auto difficulty, not quite sure what it did, but I never reached that start over because of the rot thing, the only tutorial message mentioned. I did have several spots in the game where I failed enough to make the rot progress a considerable amount, and even began to worry that I was going to find myself back at square one. In the end though, I persevered. If you are an average to seasoned gamer, I think you could easily make it through this game without losing to the rot, but if you are more on the casual end of the spectrum, you might fail and lose your progress, which I would imagine to be quite frustrating. Now for the highlight of my reviews, where I go over if I think this game could trigger the various incarnations of mental illness. As I briefly mentioned at the start of this video, I thought for sure this game would be the first where I had to give out all kinds of warnings, but as I went through the game I didn't feel anything negative. Quite the opposite, in fact. I often felt inspired or calmer. Even now, after having taken some time to collect my thoughts, I'm wondering if this would be a typical reaction, or if it's because I've experienced some of these firsthand so it wasn't as jarring to me. That said, I do think a bit of an anxiety and PTSD warning is necessary, but if you can handle these clips, I think you'd be able to make it through Hellblade no problem. However, if any of them make you feel something undesirable, then please go into this title with some caution. In summary, if you could handle the clips I showed, I highly recommend this game. It's far from a typical experience and may even be more cinematic than game, but I enjoyed this journey start to finish even if the combat felt a bit forced. As I talked about in my Maze review, I have a hard time where the price of indie games are concerned, so I will simply tell you to expect 5 to 8 hours of gameplay for a standard playthrough, and maybe 10 tops if you set out to get all of the achievements, and you can decide what price you are willing to pay for that amount of gameplay. Thank you so much for making it this far. Please subscribe and ting that little bell for more reviews and bad jokes. Give me a thumbs up if you liked it, and head down to the comments below. I love getting suggestions for games to review, and while you're at it, let me know your favorite character from Norse mythology. I hope to see you in the next one. CC out.